Good afternoon. Friends, we gather here in the protective shelter of healing love. We are free to pour out our grief, release any anger, face our emptiness, and know that God cares. We gather here conscious of others who have died and of the frailty of our own existence here on earth. We come to comfort and support one another in our common loss. We gather to hear words of hope that can drive away our despair. We gather to commend to God with thanksgiving the life of Glenn Rasmussen. Let us sing. A reading from Ecclesiastes. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather them together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. We gather today because it is a time to mourn, to remember, to celebrate the life of Gary Rasmussen. And his life was a life of service. I didn't have the honor of meeting Gary, but I did hear a lot about him. From the get-go, out of high school, he goes to the Air Force and is serving his country as a weatherman. That one caught my interest. That was my first career. He then went into more schooling and outpatient counseling for people dealing with substance abuse, and ran a halfway house for people getting out of prison, helping those who really need help so that they can become part of society once again. And moved to Maine, and married Pam and moved to Maine, and went to work at Togus, serving veterans in their psychological and psychiatric needs for years and years and years. This is a man whose life was about service. And thinking about this life of service and about the group gathered here today, I was told there would be people from many different faith traditions and no faith traditions. And I wanted to lift up the fact that a life of service is respected in all these different traditions, isn't it? Some recent reading I was done talking about the ancient Romans in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries, when they buried their people in the catacombs. They would have symbols on the catacombs. They would have Christian symbols and Jewish symbols and pagan symbols and symbols to various Greek and Roman gods, and all in the same family crypt. And they would have a party, and they would have a meal, and they would have a chair, an empty chair, for all of their departed ancestors. And everyone gathered together, including those who had gone before. And the distinctions of what faith was followed was not important. What was important was to remember those who had gone before, to celebrate the goodness that they brought to earth, to this plane of existence. Whatever plane of existence you think does or doesn't exist past this life, we know with absolute certainty that Gary Rasmussen was a life of service to others. Pam told me that was the only thing he wanted to have in his obituary, a life of service. So we remember Gary, and we will share gifts and memories and favorite readings and poems as we gather this day. Let us sing Morning Has Broken, which was at your wedding, wasn't it? Yes. Josh, could you turn the organ down a little bit? Thanks. To come up.
Hello. Very happy to be here with you today to remember and celebrate Gary's life. I am certainly honored to be asked to say a few words. I knew Gary for just shy of about 40 years. We both began our careers at the mental health center over in Waterville. I'd been there for a while when Gary came. And I don't remember that much about the short overlap we had. But I do have some pretty vivid memories of Gary in those early days. The first of which, Gary and Pam had moved into the house in back of ours, and Kathy and I went over to a social gathering, and Trivial Pursuit was being played, and Gary was there, like, answering every single question, like he had an encyclopedic knowledge of almost every area that came up. And I came from a highly competitive game-playing family, but I said, nah, no way I'm playing against this guy again. The other memory I have involves Kai and Ian. And Gary, came to me one day and he wanted to take his boys and my daughter to, Muppets down at the Cumberland County Civic Center. And being a pretty resolute introvert, the idea of going to a big place with thousands of kids and adults was not the most appealing idea, but Gary was persistent. And so we went, and I think the kids had a good time. They probably don't remember because they were really young. But there were all sorts of very large, colorful Muppets jumping all over the place. And no irreparable damage was done to me. So it was quite a success. And it was the first time and not the last time that Gary pushed me out of my comfort zone to do something, which was one of the things I appreciated about him. And the Muppets were surprisingly good skaters. Gary and I went on to collaborate closely as we both dealt with the challenges of our professional life. It's hard to believe now, but at that time, the idea that children were abused was like a new concept, and not something that was just beginning to be generally accepted. And certainly a lot of things came from that were very positive in terms of identifying at-risk children and doing things to prevent the abuse of children. But it also opened a door for adults who had been abused as children to start talking about it, because before that, they weren't really believed or listened to. And that was brand new and not something that our graduate education had necessarily prepared us for. It was pretty complicated. So Gary, I think, was quite helpful to me, and hopefully I was helpful to him in that journey. Excuse me. Gary later started working for the State Forensic Service, and once again he encouraged me to follow him there, try something new, which I did, and our collaboration continued. And that turned out being really important for my future career direction. So thank you, Gary. Most importantly, Gary and I became friends. A lot of that revolved around visits to Railroad Square Cinema and our shared interest in movies. But really, we just talked about a lot of things, professional, personal, big dose of politics. I appreciated Gary's intellect right off, but later came to see his sensitivity and compassion as we both navigated the joys and challenges of just being adults and parents. This part's gonna be hard. As Gary said the last time I saw him, he hoped we would meet again to continue our ongoing discussion. That was not to be. That ongoing discussion wasn't always simple. Gary would sometimes make statements that I would at first find confusing. He operated at a level of abstraction that was a couple of levels higher than mine, and I sometimes needed to work pretty hard to connect the threads. It was always worth the effort, and I will miss talking with Gary, and I already do. I've written a short poem for Gary. Had I known that a Pulitzer Prize winner's poem was going to be read later, I might have made a different decision, but it's too late now. So I'm good for Gary. Gary's poem. Gary was a big man by stature and in many other ways. His curiosity was large. Japanese and Native American art, travel, the many topics in psychology he plumbed so deeply. These just a few of his interests. Gary embraced life fully and heartily, always talking about something he wanted to see or do, explore. He loved good food of many varieties. He dove deep into numerous genres of film. He loved to visit new places, experience different cultures. Gary cared deeply about his family, the ups and downs he felt to his core. His heart was big. And although all the above is true, what I remember most about Gary was his laugh. It started somewhere deep inside him, came forth like a force of nature, a booming, all-in, good-natured eruption. It always made me happy to see someone give themselves over so completely to the humor of a moment. His laugh, that wonderful laugh, said everything you needed to know about Gary. And our world is a little too quiet without it. Thank you.
So I'm Pam, Gary's wife, for those who don't know. I'm going to start with a Japanese poem. The one thing about our home is that we, even when we first met and were together, we had like no furniture, but we had hundreds of books. And so I found a book on Japanese love poems while I was preparing this. I just want to share it. It says, and I cannot pronounce the author, so I'm going to skip that part. We were together only a little while, and while we believed our love, while we believed our love would last 1,000 years. So I met Gary when I was 26 and he was 38 in Nashville, Tennessee. So Gary basically led half his lifetime, BP we would say, before Pam. Gary was quite sick around Christmas time last year, so I did bring up like what he wanted when he died. We weren't sure if he was going to make it then. And one of the things he was adamant about was that he was going to write his own obituary. And so Kai and Ian, our sons, were there when the last couple weeks before he died, and Kai cleaned the area, his work area, which he knew where everything was, but most of us couldn't find anything there. And Kai found his obituary on his printer, and it's basically, so it says, "To my family, my wife and children, my teachers and my mentors, for everything. Oh, thank you. This is true for my friends and colleagues, A special thanks to those of you who have been my patients, who taught me the depth of human suffering and taught me the equally strong will to live. Thanks for all. So I think, that's what he wanted to convey, and I think it's probably, if he was here right now, that's probably what he'd want to say to everyone who's here. So I just feel that Gary's obituary is just such a reflection of a person who he was. He loved talking to people about their life stories. He might add in something about himself if it related to their stories. I'm going to share some things that I know about Gary's life. There's a lot of things, like I said, I was only with him for about half his lifetime, so a lot of things that I've learned were through stories or through other people, and there's lots of things that, I don't know about. For example, my sister Nancy, we were talking, and when Gary's obituary came out, there were some things in there that she didn't know, and she's known Gary for 42 years, so he tended to be someone who liked to listen and share things, and sometimes he would glean some information about his past or what had happened, but he was most interested in other people and what was going on in their lives. Gary was born in Fresno, California, and both sets of his grandparents were immigrated from Denmark. Being Danish was very much a part of who he was. And they settled in a Danish community in Fresno, California, which I didn't know there was a Danish community in Fresno, California, but there is. Gary was an only child, but he had a very caring, extended family in Fresno. He had many aunts and uncles and cousins who were Danish and or married a Dane. Gary went into the Air Force at 17. He had decided that he was ready to leave home, but he didn't think he was ready for college. When he was tested in the Air Force, he was going to be I don't know what the exact term is, but it's a code breaker, someone who breaks codes. So he had high clearance, but they had too many of those, so he was trained as a weatherman instead. So because he had high clearance, he served in all these high security bases, which I'm sure there are a lot of things that he probably still can't tell me what he did. He did serve in where he served was in the Southwest, and he did serve in Area 51, which became a family joke. And more than likely, the things that were cited as aliens are probably Air Force top secret things, but we'll never know. He did also, one of the bases he served at saw the development of the SR-71, which is one of the Air Force spy planes that has basically could be undetected and took pictures all over the earth. And Tom and Gary and I got to see one at the Smithsonian a few years ago, and it was pretty impressive. So he got to find out about a lot of things that probably he couldn't share about, but it was exciting for him. He went to UC Santa Barbara. He met his best friend Dave there. Dave Morris. Both Gary and Dave had a lust for learning and adventure, and because Gary tended to listen to people and not always share about himself, I learned a lot about Gary BP before Pam whenever Dave came to visit. There's a few people here that have met Dave, and when he came to visit, he always bought 2 suitcases. He ended up owning a bakery in Berkeley, so he would bring one suitcase with food, only with his clothes, the other suitcase with baked goods from his bakery. And the other thing that Gary talked about when he was in college and before he met me with all the mentors that were important to him throughout his life. And my sister's going to read one of his professors at UC Berkeley was N. Scott Momaday, who's a Native American author, was one of his professors. And I think Gary, that's one thing that Gary and I had in common. I think both of us would have stayed in college forever and just enjoyed learning, and as long as someone could support us. But I think he just always loved to learn. So I just want to share. I don't even know if my sons Kai and Ian know this story, but Gary and I meeting in Nashville. I had already been in Nashville I ended up living in Nashville about 8 years, and Gary just came in to go to school, and that was it. So a friend of mine, Paul, who I knew through Amnesty International, who was a good friend of mine, who happened to also be in the clinical psychology program at Vanderbilt too, had a party at his house, so the party was his parents had been Mennonite missionaries in Colombia, South America, and so the party was basically to invited his friends to meet his parents, and I remember meeting his parents, and there were a lot of people that I knew there, and I kind of just vaguely remembered seeing Gary and maybe talking to him a little bit, but I vaguely remembered him. And then he called me up for a date, and I was thinking, okay, who is this person? And I thought, well, Paul was a really good person who had a good heart, and I thought, well, someone who's a good friend of Paul's is worth at least one date, So I decided to go, and Gary took me to a nice restaurant, and obviously, I didn't even remember talking to him, so what we mainly talked about was the one thing we had in common was Paul, which didn't last that long, and and then not knowing that he's a person that tends to like to listen and not talk about himself, there wasn't a whole lot of conversation during that time, but he seemed nice, and I thought, well, he's a friend of Paul's, and Paul's such a good person that there must be more to this than that. So at the end of our date, I invited him to the National Storytellers Festival in Tennessee. I don't know if it's still going on, but they'd bring storytellers from all over the U.S. and from different worlds, and it was just all intense, and I'd gone to several years, and so I thought, well, I'm going with some friends, and Gary will have fun, and if things don't work out, we'll still have a good time. And later on, after we were married, of course he wouldn't tell me, but he did say that if I hadn't invited him to the Storytellers Festival, that he probably wouldn't have asked me out for another date. So I guess, you shouldn't read a book by its cover, and, get to know people and things like that. We moved to Maine so Gary can complete his internship at the VA in Augusta. And my parents had moved to Maine a couple years before that, because my father had retired from the military and got a job in Portland. So I'd been up to Maine a few times. Actually, we came to visit once before we got married, and it was a week like this, a little bit warmer in the summertime, in August, when it was awful in Nashville. We thought, oh, it's wonderful, the winters can't be that bad here. And so Gary worked in Augusta, and I worked in the Augusta school system, and we wanted a house to rent. We had a dog, and we couldn't imagine going back to an apartment. So we moved to Richmond, Maine. which was after Nashville and other places that we had been in, was quite a culture shock for us. But we did come to appreciate the generosity of Mainers when we got there, because I got pregnant pretty soon, and there were people that we didn't even know from the VA who gave us baby clothes. And when and my job in Augusta, I worked at a bunch of schools, and every single school gave us baby gifts. And I had never experienced such generosity before, just from people that I didn't even know. Gary had said he wanted a family, but he was an only child, and he definitely, when he was in school, worked with adults, always worked with adults. His only experience really with kids was one mandatory course he had to take at Vanderbilt. So I thought, okay, I worked with kids, but once Kai and Ian were born, who are twins, it became very apparent that it became a shared experience. I worked the whole time, and so there were many mornings that were up feeding both of them, watching sunrises, getting them before each going off to work. One of the things I asked, Gary's kind of notorious for his very lengthy psychological reports. And one thing I asked him, he didn't type that. He did have someone that typed them for him. But I did ask him, why did he, put so much effort into the reports that he wrote, and to just tell a part of who Gary was. He basically said that that he needed to present all the information, and that everyone deserved a fair chance in the system. And I think that really reflects who Gary is. I could say that Gary loved to travel, but however, he just loved learning about new cultures. We would pick a place that we would go in about a year, and he'd have a stack of books about this high that he would read about the different cultures or different places that we were going. I read some, but I always learned so much when I traveled with Gary, because he just loved to learn about different people and cultures and get enmeshed in what was going on. One of the most memorable trips that I had was when Gary, Kai, and Ian and I traveled to Denmark after Kai and Ian graduated from college. We spent time with many of Gary's family, who he got to know, a lot of the family he got to know when he spent a year in Denmark between when he graduated from college. I have to say, looking at pictures in Gary's family, they're always sitting down at the dinner table, or at the table, all the pictures. And when we went to Denmark, it became very apparent why, is because they have these, not as much in the US, but in Denmark, you have these multi-course dinners, and there was lots of storytelling, lots of laughing, and we were definitely embraced as part of the family. And it was just wonderful to get to a sense of that community and a sense of that heritage of his that is so much a part of him. Also, when Gary started having significant medical problems, he went back to Fresno. He stayed with his cousin Doug and his wife Marcia, and he had planned this. He had stayed for a few weeks, and he planned meet and talk to all the family members and to talk to them about why they're important in his life. And I think that's another reflection of Gary just appreciating the people in his life. I feel blessed to have shared 42 years with such a caring and compassionate soulmate, and with a lust for learning, adventure, and life. And I definitely feel that I've become a better person because of him.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ann Pariser, and this is my husband, Tom Pariser. Tom is Pam's brother and Gary's brother-in-law, and I'm just very fortunate to have married into such a kind and loving family. We're really honored to be able to read an original poem by Gary called Pam's Song. Gary wrote this the Christmas before they were married. She walks along beside me as I weather out my storms. She looks at me with clear eyes and knows how I was born. She talks to me with tenderness as she shapes her dreams to fly. She's a springtime woman who can see an eagle fly. She's a springtime woman who loves me by and by. She sees in me a beauty where I feel like a stone. She sees in me a gentleness where I feel myself alone. She sees in me a sunrise where I feel like a storm, and she loves me anyway, for she knows how I was born. She's a springtime woman who can see an eagle fly. She's a springtime woman who loves me by and by.
Her words of love come easy. Her touch is warm and firm. She comes to me with clear eyes and a life that is her own. She gives her love so openly that my love has found a home. She's a springtime woman who can see an eagle fly. She's a springtime woman who loves me by and by. Love, Gary. So I didn't know that Gary wrote poetry, but he was very understated. And in fact, I think Pam brought up earlier about the trip in the Air Force. Well, Pam and Gary visited a few years back, and I brought them both to the Smithsonian Institute. We're going to do a couple of things, and his love or interest in just everything was, he's fascinated by everything. It was lucky that they had closing hours, because we'd go from one place to another, and he just loved everything. So I thought, well, the next day, I was going to impress him. I was going to take him out to the real Air and Space Museum out near Dulles Airport. And so we get there, and I knew about the SR-71. It's the fastest plane ever built. It could fly from New York to California in under an hour, set the world speed record. And we go in there, and he's a beeline, and he's underneath the plane. And then I find out, I'm like, Gary, you're getting a little close there, and he kind of tells me that he was the mechanic on this because it was so sophisticated. They're like, yeah, weatherman, yeah, all right, So the next day, I'm like, well, there are two spy museums in D.C. There's actually a spy museum, brand new now. It's 4 stories, great stuff. You can see James Bond's building. You can actually see the pigeon that saved my grandfather's life there stuffed. Well, I'm like, no, I'm going to take them to the real spy museum. There is a National Cryptologic Museum that's attached to NSA at Fort Meade. And so we go up there, and he's there for hours, and the people that are working there are actually NSA employees. They're kind of donating their time. And, talks back and forth, and then they kind of talk around certain things. And it was pretty obvious that he knew stuff he couldn't talk about, they knew stuff they couldn't talk about, and it was going on forever. And I'm sure that when we left, they were probably saying, this Gary guy, he's pretty motivated, but I don't know, he might be a little old for us to recruit him as a spy, But that was just Gary. He was just, thirst for knowledge, great guy, very understated, and he was just somebody that you could always feel comfortable with, and like you're hearing over and over again, he's a listener, not a talker about himself, yet he has had a very fascinating life. So anyway, those are a couple of key stories I wanted to mention.
And I remember the first time I met Gary, it was almost exactly 40 years ago, and a rarity in this day and age, but I'd flown into Portland Airport, and my flight was early, and I called over to Pam and Tom's parents' house, and Pam and Gary dropped everything, and they came to pick me up, and that first impression of Gary, again, I've heard it over and over again, is a welcoming person, just welcoming and kind, and tries to get to know you, and can just expound on any topic. And that was just Gary over the years, is just always the perfect host when he's welcoming you to his house, jumping from topic to topic, his love of travel, books, art, films, politics, and just being able to go into just incredible depth on just any topic you could come up with. And that laugh was just always quick to laugh, just that big hearty laugh that just pulled you right in. And I remember also very well the last conversation we had with Gary, again, welcoming us into his house and going topic to topic, and that incredible optimism, and there's so many things he wanted to still learn, and a film he had just seen, and current events right on the tip of his tongue. And it's just, Gary, we're just really going to miss you.
It's an honor to be here today to share in the celebration of Gary's life. I'm Nancy. I'm Pam's sister, and I didn't realize it's 42 years. I thought it was 40, so. Oh. Yeah. I just want to say a few words, too. Common themes. Gary was a complex man, but he always tried to simplify these complexities and share it with people beyond that couldn't quite grasp his intellect. And I think of him when a sage friend had shared with me saying that when a loved one passes, the memories of that person become more vivid, warm, and comforting. She was right. And when I think of Gary, these common themes, I'm going to repeat them because that's so similar to what has been said today about Gary. He was a master of the simple pleasures of life that others like myself sometimes take for granted. We overlook, or I'm just not paying enough attention, but Gary was paying attention. He lived in the present. He had the present moment in his daily life, and it came naturally to him. In my mind, he was a true master of the simple pleasures of life that we should all aspire to live for, that he lived for every day. What often comes to mind when I think of Gary, or the essence of Gary, is very similar to everyone has said, but I want to say it again. A good meal. There's always food in that essence, right? He loved a good meal. He loved to be with his friends and family. And he always had stimulating conversations. I always left learning something and wanting to learn something more because he had stimulated my thoughts. He had a great sense of humor. And that laugh, I have it in what I wanted to say too, a good belly laugh. And he would bring it on, and all of us would start to laugh spontaneously, even if we didn't understand what he was laughing about. It would bring us into his good sense of humor. Appreciation for a beautiful piece of art that he had, petting his dogs, spending time with his family, the delight in seeing a beautiful loon at his lake house, a good movie, discovering the gentle philosophy of the Native Americans and the Japanese, the joy of travel, which has been said, and experiencing a different culture. One of the warm memories I hold dear was the first time I met Gary. I guess that's a common theme too. When we first meet him, he's kind of that larger-than-life person. We were all students at Vanderbilt. I was a college student, and Pam was deeply in love with Gary and was excited for me to meet him. And I thought we would meet in a bar or on campus or, at a restaurant, but that wasn't what Gary had in mind. It was something more intimate. He wanted to get to know me, and he wanted to have me over with Pam for dinner at his house. Dinner, a home-cooked meal? I'm like, I'm there. And I still remember that meal, so it was 42 years ago. It was a lemon scallop pasta. And I begged him to make it, and he did make it for me a couple more times, and it was wonderful. I remember walking into a house on a warm Nashville evening. The smell was amazing, and the food was amazing. The conversation was stimulating, fun, and it was a wonderful cadence, lots of laughter, and you just felt the love between Pam and Gary, which was wonderful, classic Gary. So that's one of the warm memories I have of his simple pleasures that he brought to my life, and I'm grateful to have known Gary for so long. The reading that Pam selected for me was by his professor from University of California at Santa Barbara, by N. Scott Momaday, who is a Pulitzer Prize winner, from his book, The Earth Keeper. The story from which my name comes is also the story of my 7 sisters, who were born into the sky and became the stars of the Big Dipper. The story is very important, for it relates to the stars. It is a bridge between the earth and the heavens. It is no earth without the sun and the moon. There is no earth without stars. When we die, Dragonfly says, we go to the farther camps. Death is not the end of life. There is life in the farther camps. The stars are the fires in the farther camps. In the making of my song, there is a crystal wind and the burnished dark of dusk. There is the memory of elders dancing in firelight at 2 meadows, where the reeds whisper, I sing, and there is gladness in it, and laughter like the play of spinning leaves. I sing, and I am gone from sorrow to the farther camps.
If anyone else has some memories that they would like to share, you're invited to come up to the microphone. We have 9 people, or 9 logins online, so you have to be at the microphone or they can't hear you. Okay. And let us. So the family wants to invite you all to gather out on the front porch afterwards for conversation, and just, some informal gathering. A final blessing. With faith in the goodness of the cycle of life and death, we entrust Glenn Rasmussen to eternity. We give thanks for all that he was to those who loved him and for his faithfulness to serving others his whole life. We give thanks that for Gary all sickness and sorrow are ended and death itself is past, and that he has entered the home where all people gather in peace. Let us remember Gary well. Go forth in peace.